I already introduced myself here, but for those of you who are joining us in Wellsville and Olean, my name is Stu. I am the campus pastor here in Arcade, and we're glad that you've joined us today, as well as our online viewers. I'd like to welcome you as well. We have been going through series here recently about the wonders of Jesus, and we're going to kind of continue that. But, I want to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. This past Thursday was Thanksgiving. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'm sure if you were like me, I'm sure that your Thanksgiving table probably looked something like this. I know if you're like us, by the time we all sit around the table, there's like no room for the food and the plates, and because it's just so full. And I'm sure you, like I, stuffed yourself to the point where you said, I'm never going to eat again. And I did really good with that, right up until the time it was time for cold turkey sandwiches. That's one of my favorite parts of Thanksgiving, and so I stuck with that vow up until it was time for sandwiches later, and then that went out the window. But great time to gather together as a family, sit around the table, enjoy a meal. But what would you think if you came in for Thanksgiving dinner and this was what was on the table? One turkey leg and one piece of pumpkin pie. The whole family walks in and this is what's there. And we all have that crazy Uncle Louie who's going to grab the turkey leg and that's gone. Nobody else is going to get any. And you're thinking, okay, how am I going to feed everybody with this? It's a little bit like kind of what Jesus ran into in the story we're going to read today. We're going to take a look today at what Jesus' response when he came up against a similar situation. And hopefully we can learn from that and we can be encouraged by this as well as we come up with overwhelming situations. Today we're going to continue our study in the miracles of Jesus as we witness the wonder of Jesus feeding the 5,000. It's going to be found in John chapter 6, first 15 verses. You can follow along here on the screen. It's also in the Pew Bibles. It's on page 891 if you want to follow along in your Pew Bibles. And I'm going to read it up here. So John chapter 6. It says, after this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. Just so you know, 200 denarii, that'd be about 8 months' wages. So take a look at whatever your salary is and think about 8 months' wages. That's a lot of bread. That's a lot of bread. That means there's a lot of people. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many? And Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves, left by those who had eaten. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. And perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Quite an amazing story, isn't it? I want to dig into that a little bit and just see Jesus' response, to this situation, overwhelming situation. I can't imagine turning around and looking and finding all these people. So I want to take a look at that. Starting right out in verse 2, it talks about the crowd following him. And I got to think about that. Why did the crowd follow him? It says because they saw the signs he was doing on the sick, but I thought, that just doesn't answer it for me. Were they impressed by the things that he did? Was it like, some kind of a carnival sideshow? Hey, he can spin plates on a stick, and he can juggle the ball, and he can heal the sick, and come see Jesus right here next to the bearded lady. I don't know. Were they following him because, hey, what's the next thing he's going to do? I'm sure that had to be kind of cool. This guy's doing these miracles. Let's see what he's going to do next. Or were they following him because they were true believers? Because they wanted to know Christ, and they wanted to learn from him? I think realistically, there probably was some of both. I think there was some of both. Scripture gives us a little clue. It talks about the fact that it was Passover time. Passover, many of the Jews would have been in Jerusalem. So the fact that these people were not in Jerusalem, they were there with Jesus, leads me to believe that there were definitely some that were followers of Christ, and they were there because they wanted to learn from him. But I think realistically, there were some of both. And I got thinking about that, and I thought, sometimes it doesn't matter why we're there to meet Christ. It doesn't matter why these people were there. The fact is they were there, and they heard about Christ, and they heard his teachings, and they were changed. We have a DNA that we follow here. On my left, your right, says, found people find people. We believe that lost people matter to God, so we go out and we do these outreaches. They had an outreach in Olean this past week, Friday night, and we have an outreach coming up here in Arcade this weekend. And why do we do that? Why do we go out and invite people to church? Is it so we can get more people sitting in the chairs? Not really. It's so those people can come and can hear from Jesus. Whether they're here for the show, like they were there to see the show, or whether they're there because they want to follow Christ, when you come and when you meet Jesus, you're changed. Doesn't matter why you were seeking him, you're changed. And that's why we invite people to church, because we want them to be changed, to be different. And it doesn't really matter why those people were there. The fact is they were, and they heard Christ, and they were changed. The end of that passage confirms that they saw who Jesus was, and they were changed. Going on a little bit farther in verse 5, Jesus kind of turns around and sees all these people. And then he says to Philip, where are we to buy bread so all these people can eat? And that last part I love this. He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. I think there's a couple different reasons Jesus asked this question. Number one, I think that he wanted them to recognize the problem. As we've been going through these different miracles these last few weeks, as Pastor Jeremy has been preaching through them, the first miracle we looked at was changing the water to the wine. And Jesus made sure they understood that there was a problem. The problem was they were out of wine. And so they had to do something. They had to recognize the problem. When Jesus healed the boy, there was a sick boy. There was a dying boy. There was a problem. We talked about last week, the paralytic beside the bed, the invalid beside the pool. And there was a problem. There's an invalid who needs help. And I think that's what Jesus wanted them to understand here was there's a problem. Okay, here's the problem. We got all these mouths to feed. What are we going to do? And I don't think he said this really to test their reasoning or their problem-solving skills. In fact, other scriptural accounts of this actually talk about how the disciples even had said, hey, let's send these people to the neighboring village. Let's send them over here. Let's send them over here to this other village where they can get something to eat. So they kind of were problem-solving on their own. And they were, trying to do what they thought would be right to help the problem. But obviously, as we see here, that wasn't exactly what Jesus had in mind. I think sometimes the same for us. When we come up against these problems, we try to, oh, Jesus, let's do this. Let's go this way. Let's fix it this way. But he's not really looking for our answer, is he? He wasn't looking for their opinion, their suggestions to how to fix the problem. He was looking for their trust and their faith. And were they going to trust him to meet their needs and to supply for him? And it's not all that different for us. Jesus already knew what he was going to do for those people. And it's the same for us. God already has in mind what he's going to do. The question is, are we going to trust him? And that's a tough question, isn't it? Because often we go to prayer on more of a suggestion. Hey God, why don't you do it this way? Why don't you take care of the problem this way? Because I know best, right? Instead of saying, okay, here's the problem. I trust you. I trust you. And so Andrew, I love Andrew. Andrew always introducing people to Jesus. And here he is again. Andrew finds this young boy, and he said, well, here's a young boy with his lunch. 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? I looked into it a little bit. I had thinking, 5 loaves of bread. When I think of loaves of bread, I think of a loaf of bread. Really, it probably was something closer to like a dinner roll. A loaf of bread was probably closer to like a dinner roll, or maybe like I was thinking of like a pita bread. There's 5 of those, not 5 loaves of bread, and 2 fish. And we're not talking, fish like you lie about catching. We're talking about fish, little fish, sardine type fish. So as I thought about him, my mind went back to grade school, to elementary school. And I was thinking about elementary school, and my 2 favorite things in elementary school were lunch and gym. Unless, of course, it was a nice day and you got to go out on the playground, and then that probably took the cake. But, I love those things. And so I was thinking about my lunch pail when I was a kid. And this is what my lunch pail looked like when I was a kid. The Dukes of Hazzard. Man, I loved the Dukes of Hazzard when I was a kid. Just recently at our work day at Shingle House, I have a Dukes of Hazzard hat that I had on in Shingle House. And Bruce Miller and I were talking about it and kind of reminiscing about the good old days of watching the Dukes of Hazzard. But, I had this lunch pail, and let me tell you what, I was cool because I had that lunch pail. And the other thing I liked about that lunch pail was it had my lunch in it. And if you wanted some food, you'd better bring your own because that was mine. And I was not in a hurry to share. As kids, we're not real good at sharing, are we? And I was thinking about it. Why is that? Well, I think part of it is because I like my stuff. And if I give you some of my stuff, then I don't have as much. And I don't like that. But the more I thought about it, it's not just kids that aren't real good at sharing, is it? A lot of times as adults, we are not the best at sharing what we've been given. But it's interesting as we've gone through these studies, I was thinking about that, thinking about like when talk about Jesus turning the water to wine. And Jesus said to them, before he did it, could he have done the miracle and just said, okay, now those jugs are full of wine? He could have, I think. But he said, go fill the jugs with water and bring them back. And then he turned the water into wine. Jesus kind of made them do something. We talked about Jesus healing the official's son. And the official talked about doing something. I think Pastor Jeremy said, he said he walked 23.2 miles. He put some effort in. And then Jesus did this miracle. And it's interesting that here's this little boy who, as we've said, kids aren't always the best at sharing. But here's this little boy who says, here's my lunch. It's not much, but it's my lunch. You can have it. And then look what Jesus does with it. Jesus often asks us to do something, to step forward. But then he blesses it. And it's funny, we put in a little, and then he gives us so much. His output always exceeds our input. Doesn't it? He may want us to do a little something, but his output always exceeds our input. And as I was thinking about that, I guess another way to put that is maybe in our own lives, if you put what little you have into God's hands, he can make a lot out of your little. And I don't know about you, but I'm so thankful for that, because there's a lot of times I feel like I don't have much to offer. But if I give him my little, he can make a lot out of my little. And I'm thankful for that. You see, especially in this situation, God's math isn't like our math all the time. You know, in our math, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and that equals 1 meal for this young boy. Makes sense. So then Jesus gets a hold of it, and now 5 loaves plus 2 fish equal 5,000 meals. And actually, really, if you want to get technical, it really wasn't 5,000 people. It talks about 5,000 men. And that's because culturally at the time, they would have only counted the men. They wouldn't have counted any women and children. So there were 5,000 men. Maybe taking some liberty, but, let's assume those men were married and had 2 children. Now, obviously, I'm sure some weren't married, some had more than 2 children. So I think it probably evens out. But if you do the math, that 5,000 mouths now becomes 20,000 mouths to feed. So now, 5 plus 2 doesn't equal 1 meal, it equals 20,000 meals. How's that for Common Core math? Things are always changing, aren't they? Just try to think about that for a minute. Can you imagine? Try to think about planning a banquet for 20,000 people. I was thinking about that and I thought, what's the biggest party you've ever been to? Graduation party, wedding, I don't know, something like that. For me, I was thinking about it and I thought, I was thinking about our wedding. And Amy and I had what I would consider a pretty good-sized wedding. We had somewhere around 250 people there. And I can remember planning for it and finding a hall, and we had at the Delavan Training Center a reception. I can remember going, and my father-in-law is awesome. He's so analytical. It was awesome. He had his tape measure and his pad, and we went to the hall, and he measured it all out, and then went home and got out his graph paper and drew it all to scale of exactly where the tables had to be, exactly with the space in the middle, so we could maximize that space to get the most people in there and comfortably. And I so missed that about him. But, there was a lot of time and a lot of effort that went into planning that party for 250 people. Can you imagine planning that for 20,000 people? And then how much food would you need? Obviously here we know how much food Jesus needed, but I would imagine if, as we were planning for our wedding, and we got talking about food, and I said to Amy, I figure about 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish ought to take care of it. I don't think she'd have let me in on much of the planning after that. It just, and how many waiters would you need to distribute food to 20,000 people? And then my mind kind of kept going, and it was outdoors. It talks about, they're in a grassy area. So I'm thinking, if it's outdoors, you're going to see some of these around, right? Going to have some porta-johns someplace, right? And so I was thinking, man, how many porta-johns do you need for 20,000 people? So I did what every red-blooded American would do. I Googled it. And yes, you can look it up on Google. And it asked for a time frame. So I thought, well, I'm going to guess this whole thing maybe took 6 hours. So put in 6 hours, 20,000 people. How many porta-johns do you come up with? There it is, 186 toilets. Can't you just picture them like over along the trees? There's this whole row of toilets. But I can't imagine how overwhelming that had to be to turn around and see all those people following me and going, how am I going to feed all these people? I think of the time and effort that went into planning our wedding and our reception, and for that small number. And here they plan this for 20,000 people on a whim. We planned for months. This is Jesus going up the hill, and he turns around and sees all these people behind him and says, okay, let's do this. It's just amazing to think of, And I got thinking about, what would I do? I'd probably freeze. Sometimes when we see these huge obstacles, we just freeze. and we're almost paralyzed. What can we do? And a lot of times we don't do anything. Oh, it's too big. I can't take care of that, so I don't do anything. I came across recently a study that was really interesting. The study was to find out about people and their giving, and they sent out 2 charity letters regarding the needs of children in Africa. And the first charity letter they sent out was very statistical and had all these numbers and statistics of the great number of children in Africa and their needs and how much money it would cost to feed them and all these things. And having been there myself and saw it with my own 2 eyes, I can only imagine how astronomical those numbers had to be. And so one letter had all those kind of numbers on it. And then the second letter they sent out just pinpointed one 7-year-old girl in Africa. And it talked about the needs of that one 7-year-old girl. And then they kind of waited to see what was given for this. And it's very interesting. On average, the people that received the statistical letter of all the needs, they gave $1.14 each. But the people that learned about the need of one single girl in Africa, on average, gave $2.38. They gave more than double than the other letter. You know, so often we feel overwhelmed by the scale of a problem, we don't do anything. We don't do anything. Because we don't think we can fix it. We can't make a difference. And really we need to do for one what we wish we could do for all. We need to do for that one what we wish we could do for all. And these things remind us that things may seem insurmountable, but we can have an impact. Can one single person meet all the needs of the children in Africa? Absolutely not. No way. So does that mean we don't do anything? I don't think that's the answer either. I think we need to do what we can, and then we need to leave the rest to God. And then we need to be reminded of how awesome our God really is. It's a word I think we may use too much in our English language, but it's one of the few words that can describe Jesus. And we need to sit back and think about, the magnitude of him feeding 20,000 people with a Lunchable. And I love the fact that there's leftovers. I love it. Not just leftovers, 12 basketfuls of leftovers. More than they started with in leftovers. And I think Jesus did that for a reason. Can you imagine the discussion, maybe the next day as the disciples are together, or maybe there's some other people with them, and they're eating these leftovers, and somebody says, boy, this is good bread. Where'd you get this? And the disciple kind of just leans back, says, let me tell you about this bread. Let me tell you how a young boy was willing to give up his lunch that could barely feed him, but yet Jesus fed 20,000 people with it. And I just think of the stories surrounding those leftover meals. That's what we need to be doing. We need to be sharing those things in our lives as well. We need to be sharing what God is doing in our life with others. It's one of the things I'm going to encourage you to do. As you gather together in your small groups, share what God has done for you, what God is doing for you. Maybe get together for a meal. Get together for coffee with somebody this week. And just say, let me tell you what God's doing in my life. Let me tell you what God has done for me. Let me tell you about the miracle that he's done in my life. We need to share those stories. We're going to make a way that you can do that on our website. There's going to be a Facebook post. If you're on Facebook, you'll see the link there. But also, we're going to, on our website, if you go to the sermon archives, and once you pull up this sermon, there'll be a place there where you can click, and you can share your story there. And we're hoping to even maybe even have a chance to film a couple of these stories. But I think it's so important for us to share what God is doing. Yeah, it's important for us to share about these things like Jesus feeding 20,000. But you know what? He's still doing those miracles today. And we need to share those with each other and encourage each other. We need to be faithful with the little things. Here, this young boy didn't have much to offer, but he offered it. We need to be faithful. We need to be faithful in little things so that God can do the big things. And I think our giving is an example of this. Tithing in the Old Testament was a sign of obedience and faith. They didn't collect all of their wait for their harvest to come in, and then at the end count out 10% and then take that and give that to God. No, they gave their first fruits. They gave their first fruits to God, and they trusted Him for the rest. We need to do that in our lives. We need to give God our first and our best, and then trust Him to bless the rest. I know it's not that easy, but I think sometimes that's not our test of problem solving, but our test of faith and trust. And then when we're overwhelmed by a situation, as I'm sure Jesus had to be, when he turned around and saw those people, when we're overwhelmed by that situation, that is a great time to witness the wonders of God in our lives. And it doesn't only happen when we trust God for the big things. Do we need to do that? Yes, we need to do that, absolutely. But I think it happens when we obey God in the little things. The everyday obedience of following Christ. We need to offer up those little areas of obedience to God. Even as little as 5 little loaves of bread and 2 little fish. I'd like to invite our worship teams to come forward in all 3 locations, and I'm going to close this in prayer. Please join me if you would. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for this young boy. Thank you for his willingness to give what little he had. That Jesus could do an amazing miracle through it. And Lord, I pray that you would guide and direct us in the same way. That you would help us to be obedient with the little things. That you would help us to give those little things to you so that you can do amazing, wonderful things. And I thank you that you still are in the miracle business. And I pray, Lord, that you would open up opportunities for us to share these stories with others, that we might encourage them, that we might lift you up, and that others might have a chance to meet you and be changed. We thank you and praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.